Now, I'm delighted to say time to say a very good morning to Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter, how are you?
Well, I'm still with us, not dead yet.
Yeah, still fighting the good fight, still managing to get your views out there. Luckily, we shall be doing the same later on, of course, this time hopefully without any interruptions, shall we say. But we apologise for that, basically, because we do edit things from time to time. I'm not sure what happened, but let's talk about Scotland and your view that it is already more or less lost to the UK.
Well, when the Blairite Revolution happened in 1997, it was, amongst other things, an attack on Britain as a whole and the United Kingdom especially. It had many, many implications, some of them now being felt in Ireland very strongly as well. But the whole Blairite idea is hostile to the idea of Britain as a conservative and rather old-fashioned state, and they always wanted European integration and the destruction and demolition of most of the characteristics of this country. And part of that obviously meant that Britain is fundamentally an idea which unites the two countries and was particularly strengthened during the Second World War and the strong wave of united patriotism which affected both England and Scotland, of course Wales as well at that time. And with the weakening of those things, the bonds between the countries weakened. The New Labour, I think, believed that they could have it both ways. They thought that they could have an independent-ish Scottish Parliament, but at the same time they could continue to run Scotland. What they never understood, I think, was the huge force of Scottish nationalism, which eventually flattened the Labour Party and has almost completely crushed all opposition in Scotland. I don't think that it's now possible for us to prevent a second referendum, and I would be very surprised if that second referendum doesn't vote to leave. And I think the sensible attitude towards this, you said forever in your introduction, I think that it's quite possible that Scotland might come back voluntarily into a union with England, but I don't think it will come back if we try and block its attempts to leave now, if we get ourselves into a great brawling wrestling match saying you can't hold a referendum, you can't go. And if we try and patronise them, indeed, as many people patronised Britain when it sought to leave the European Union, none of that will work. And we certainly shouldn't behave in the way that Spain is behaving towards Catalonia, of actually using the law and imprisoning people, for goodness sake, who are trying to get independence there. I say to the Scottish people and everybody in Scotland who wants independence, I quite understand your desire. In fact, if I was Scottish, I might well share it. But I wish you weren't going, but since you are going, I wish you the best of luck and would say, if you ever want to come back, you'll be very welcome. We'll leave a light burning. I think that's the only intelligent attitude for people who hope for a reunited kingdom at some point to take. And in the meantime, I think we have a lot of work to do in England to try and reconstruct that country. And I think we should be reminded of that. One of the things about Scotland is people are very happy there with their nationality and are very positive about it and keen on it. And I think that's a good thing. Whereas in England, you hear very little these days of pride in or indeed knowledge of the country in which we live. I'd like to see us be more proud of it, be more knowledgeable about it, and value much more highly the many great gifts that we've been given. So I just don't think that taking a hard line, sending the Prime Minister north of the border to tell them not to leave or threatening them with economic punishment or saying it will all go wrong will work. And therefore, I think it's crazy to pursue that line. If you really want, in the long-term future, to keep relations between England and Scotland good, then let them go if they want to. Wish them luck. But as I say if ever you want to come back, you'd be very, very welcome indeed.
I think the trouble is, Peter, that there's a view, I think, that is taken in England of Scotland by people, I'm not suggesting you're one of them, by people who don't know much about Scotland. And I think, both my parents are from Scotland. I worked in Scotland for some time. You know, I used to go for Easter holidays every single year there as a child. And I think I know the Scottish people very well. And it is interesting that England, of all of the nations in the four corners of the United Kingdom, is the most ashamed of itself in terms of its sort of public persona and in terms of what Englishness means and all of that. And you're absolutely right to say that the Scots have a great pride in being Scottish. But I think we've made the mistake down here, particularly the political class, of thinking that one, Nicola Sturgeon is doing a fantastic job, two, everybody thinks she's doing a fantastic job, and three, it is now probably inevitable that almost everyone there wants to become an independent nation. And I don't think that's true.
Well, I don't think Nicola Sturgeon's doing a fantastic job. I think she's doing a terrible job, and I think almost all the major aspects of Scottish government, one which particularly concerns me, education, are far inferior to what they would have been 40 or 50 years ago, and they're not making them any better. I don't like the existence of a national police force. I look at Scotland, I see very little sign of an opposition press, or indeed of an effective parliamentary opposition. These are bad things. I do suspect, actually, that if Scotland does leave the United Kingdom, it will pretty rapidly develop an opposition. Because people will realise the strong need for one. At the moment, that's being pushed to one side. No, I've got no admiration for Nicola Sturgeon. I also know there are many very, very serious Scottish people who don't want to leave. But I think I went up during the last days of the referendum to areas of Scotland which I know. My first memories are Scottish. My father was stationed at the Rosyth Naval Base, and my earliest memories are of Rosyth and of Dunfermline. And I feel very, very fondly towards Fife and that part of Scotland to this day, which makes me slightly unusual among English people. And I remember Scottish voices before I ever heard English ones. So I don't have that sort of, I wouldn't call it a prejudice, but a sort of feeling of vague, how should
detachment,
I say?
almost.
Detachment from Scotland of English people. How I feel not at home there, but certainly I've always taken great pleasure in visiting Scotland. So, and I found myself sympathising with some of particularly the last people I interviewed the night of the referendum vote near a polling station in Rosyth were a young couple. He, as I recall, was in favour of leaving, and she was in favour of staying. But they were on good terms with each other. I thought this was a sign of optimism and hope, and both of them had intelligent arguments. The most intelligent arguments I heard were in Cowdenbeath from a 70-year-old woman, very stern, strict, beautifully spoken English, obviously very well educated in the old Scottish way, and she enunciated all the arguments against far better than I could have done. I felt rather ashamed that I'd been swept up in the idea that maybe it was a good idea. But the truth is that people of that generation are becoming a minority and will become a minority. I don't think that can be prevented. So that's why I think it will happen.
Yes, I think I agree with.
That's yourself to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with your analysis that the government's continued refusal to give a second referendum is probably wrong. But I think what they ought to do, and this is where I differ from you in terms of the inevitability of it, what they ought to do, I think, is explain how closely tied the two nations are. For example, a huge number of people who work in the civil service, in the tax business alone up in Edinburgh, the business of the Rosyth Naval Yards, the business of Faslane, the defence connection there, and what it would really mean for Scotland to be independent, because I think there's a kind of a flowery sense of independence for a lot of people in Scotland, particularly the young, who think it's a great idea, but they haven't really thought of what it would actually be like. They think they want to be part of the European Union, and that's now the driver for most of them. But as you were saying, because of Catalonia, I just don't see Europe ever saying to Scotland, you can be an independent small nation within the EU.
Well, here's a difference in that. Now that Britain is not an EU member, that argument has weakened. What the EU could have said before was that secession from an EU member was something they couldn't support, and Spain would have been very firm on insisting on that. But secession from a non-EU member may be viewed differently in the Commission, and I think they may be quite keen to see it happen. And it also is also the case, of course, that the support for leaving the European Union in Scotland is much lower than in England. And many Scots feel that they've been pulled into something they themselves don't support. The other thing, people are not actually, they ought to be, but they're not. People don't vote entirely rationally. They also vote emotionally, and you cannot counter emotional arguments necessarily with facts and reason, much as I wish it was so. And remember, in this case, particularly the UK's decision to vote to leave the European Union, those who supported that have to recognise that many of them voted, even though they knew and had been told that there would be, and there are, economic disadvantages from leaving, because they thought that independence was more important. You can't take that view of the European Union and tell the Scots that they must vote entirely according to economic rationality, can you?
Well, no, I don't think so. But interestingly enough, I mean, I've said this recently a lot, that if there was to be independence granted to Scotland, the SNP more or less would cease to exist, because there wouldn't be any point in being the Scottish National Party, they'd have to stand for something other than independence, and they'd have to therefore look inside their own party and realise actually they're a bit of a hodgepodge of different political philosophies, because you're quite right to say that Labour sort of sold the farm, as it were, because they had no clue that they were giving away power. Because, I mean, Labour used to run Scotland like like a trade union used to run Britain. I mean, 48 seats they used to have in Parliament. They practically lost them all. The first minister of Scotland was from the Labour Party, but the SNP cleverly worked out that in fact the Labour Party had done nothing for the people of Scotland. They just considered a load of safe seats that would get them into government.
Oh, Labour Party were hopelessly complacent, but before them, of course, the Unionists, who were the Conservative branch in Scotland, had become complacent too. And people forget how hugely they used to dominate the Scottish representation in Parliament, and indeed Scotland as a whole. An amazing fact that is that the Scottish equivalent of the Daily Mirror, the left-wing daily paper, was until quite late on a unionist newspaper, because that was the dominant attitude of Scotland. When the main issue is union or not, the ordinary political divisions are squashed, as they also are in Northern Ireland, where unionism contains a lot of people who would be in the Labour Party if they were in England, for instance. So the moment independence actually happens, it's true, I think the SNP will begin to break apart. It's already got some pretty severe ructions. I mean, the relations between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon are pretty poisoned, I think. Yeah. And there are plenty of reasons why it might. But I think before the achievement of secession, I doubt very much whether that will happen. Labour seems to me to be completely dead in Scotland, and the Tories can't really rise beyond a very small segment. So I think that if we want to hope for the development of proper two-party politics in Scotland again, almost certainly it won't happen until Scotland has left the UK, which is a very strange paradox, but it's alas the case.
Yeah, I don't know if you had a chance to read it at the weekend. Gillian Bowditch wrote a piece in the Sunday Times Scottish edition about the farce of this Alex Salmond inquiry. And I think this is quite a key point as well, because I think Nicola Sturgeon is very much dancing on the lip of a volcano here, because there's an awful lot going on beneath the surface that we can't really see. She's basically calling for a proper independent inquiry to be done, where proper scrutiny is applied, where proper evidence is actually presented, and rather than having all sorts of stuff redacted and held back and withdrawn and denied, actually this could be a problem for Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, it could. I mean, in my view, I have to say, having met him, I find Alex Salmond to be one of the most intelligent and thoughtful people in British politics. He probably wouldn't want to be described as such, but there it is true. Whereas I find Nicola Sturgeon a pretty cliched and banal figure. Salmond is very interesting and has a lot of fascinating thoughts on areas way beyond the national issue. And I'm surprised that it's been possible, as it were, to keep him away from the centre of Scottish politics for so long. And there is a conflict there waiting to erupt. But how it will erupt, I don't know. But probably, as I say, not before. First of all, the much prophesied and I think probably undoubted triumph of the SNP in the coming elections, and the resulting demand for a second referendum.
I mean, much of the strength of the SNP goes back to Alex Salmond's stewardship of it, because he'd worked out very early on that it was much easier to become popular by asking for things you could never get and blaming Westminster for not giving them. And that was a work of genius. And people really became to resent the Westminster Parliament. And even now, when you see people like Ian Blackford, every single week at Prime Minister's Questions, claiming that Scotland is being denied funds, claiming that Scotland has been starved of resources, which is completely not the case.
Well, nothing's ever your fault in these circumstances, is it? It's complete luxury politics, but then the moment comes when it is your fault. But also, Alex Salmond was very clever in developing a form of nationalism which Guardian readers can swallow, civic nationalism rather than the kind which they tend to associate with
flag waving
and all the rest. So that was also very cunning. This is a project which has not been run by fools, and by and large, the response of English politicians has been pretty fumbly. In fact, I'm still pretty certain that the referendum would have gone in favour of secession last time if Gordon Brown hadn't made his intervention at the last moment, which, from what I could see, swung a lot of Labour votes away from independence at the last moment. But of course, implicit in that was a promise to give an awful lot of concessions which I think David Cameron pretty much blew fairly shortly afterwards. So therefore increasing the resentment and the likelihood of secession. It's a big problem, breaking up a country. I watched the Soviet Union break up into its component parts after 1991. And in fact, oddly enough, horrible though much of the Russian regime is, they didn't handle it too badly compared with some people, but it was gigantic and revolutionary. And it can happen.
And it wasn't entirely bloodless either, was it?
Not entirely, no, but it could have been a lot more bloody, in my view, than it actually was. And it yet maybe, I think the difficulty between Russia and Ukraine is unresolved and could, I'm afraid, break out in the future in fairly horrible ways. And these are dangers, which people once you start going down that slope, there are dangers.
Yeah.
The less hostility you engender, the easier you make it to carry on good terms, the better, once you've recognised that it's going to happen anyway.
Yes. I wonder if we could talk a little before we stop about the lockdown scenario. I'm seeing this weekend a definite sort of step change, if you want, in the message, as it were. Lots of people now coming out with facts and figures about education, about the Mail story this morning, 350 billion, the cost of a lost generation of kids not going to school, mental health in the Sunday Times, a study by the Mental Health Institute saying that a quarter of teenagers are now anxious and nervous about the future. And also now we're seeing today the Isle of Man lifting all the restrictions.
Yes, well, the Isle of Man is very special. Of course, they can pretty much control entry and exit, and presumably they feel if they carry on doing that, then they're masters of their own destiny. We'll see if that's so. I obviously must wish them the very best of luck and hope it goes well. But it'd be a far different thing trying to do the same thing here if you supported lockdown as a method. But what is interesting is sort of mainstreaming of many of the arguments of lockdown skeptics among people who aren't lockdown skeptics, and the increasing recognition of the cost of this, which is simply undeniable, which was not really recognised or taken into account at the beginning. Maybe sooner or later we will move towards the cost benefit analysis, which has always been badly needed. Whether this is, even if you accept, and it seems to be that the evidence for this remains extremely slender, that lockdowns are an effective way of controlling the disease. Even if you accept that, you have the second argument: is it even so justified? Is the immense cost, the colossal damage that we've been discussing, and the enormous economic damage which we're building up for the future, is it worth it? Can it be justified for the effect which you claim to be having? That's the argument that I.
And that, of course, is the argument which makes the most sense, isn't it? Because, of course, why would you not look at that? I mean, the idea that they haven't been looking at that is quite extraordinary. I saw a guest on Talk Radio over the weekend talking about the United States experience and how basically most states have got more or less the same figures of death and infection, regardless of whether their lockdown was harsh or not so harsh. And so the inference suggesting basically that the lockdown didn't really make any difference to the number of deaths, but what it did make a difference to was the economy.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you'd have to concede the possibility that restricting people in their homes might make some difference, though how much seems to be very hard to measure. It's a possibility. As I say, the evidence that it's had any hugely dramatic effect remains extremely elusive. And the contrast, for instance, between California and Florida, which have taken completely different attitudes with very similar outcomes, is yet another illustration of this. The problem for lockdown advocates, that they cannot really come up, if you look around the globe, with evidence that their method has been successful. But the cost of it has been universal. Absolutely nobody doubts the cost of it.
No.
And there is the problem. It has cost a huge amount, will continue to do so, materially and in lives and health and education.
Well, the SAGE figures that came out of the weekend said that two things, really, both of them based on modelling, I suppose. One, that the lockdown could cost the lives of 100,000 or more people. But similarly, had the lockdown not happened, there could be another 100,000 dead from COVID. But again, that's their modelling rather than actual evidence. It's what they think would have happened.
I think there's a growing amount of research. So this started with some research done partly at the University of Loughborough some months ago, and it grows all the time, particularly on, for instance, failed cancer treatment and things of that kind, which shows way beyond modelling of speculation that the measures taken have actually caused deaths and severe restriction of people's lives in a measurable fashion. The claim that the lockdown has saved lives remains completely speculative. And I think one is here faced with evidence versus speculation. And it seems to me that if you have evidence versus speculation, evidence should win.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And right on time as well, Peter. That concludes our conversation for the day. We're hopeful that we'll have the head-to-head between you and Dan Hodges this Wednesday. We'll keep you informed on that one. We're just needing to kind of dot a few I's across a few T's. Hopefully Peter Hitchens versus Dan Hodges on Talk Radio TV will be available later on this week.